Well, hello everybody. I greet you from Cape Town, South Africa. My name is Charles van der Walt, and I'm the head of security research at Orange Cyber Defense. Orange Cyber Defense is a leading provider of security solutions and products based or headquartered in Paris, France. I'm joined today by my colleague Vikas.
Hello, everybody. I'm Vikas Ross, Senior Security Researcher at Orange Cyber Defense, also based in Cape Town.
So we're here today to share with you our presentation titled All Your LAN Are Belong to Us. And really what we want to do is explore with you the new set of risks and threats that emerge because your people are working from home. And in particular, we want to look at the role that specific security technologies and secure remote access play in countering those threats. So we all know that COVID and the pandemic and lockdown has changed the game. Everyone's talking about it. It seems clear that something is different. What's not so clear, I think, is what's different. What has actually changed? And there's this perception that because our people are working from home, they're going to be attacked more, and that somehow COVID and the pandemic are going to play a role in those, in that wave of new attacks. But a study by Checkpoint recently suggests that this may not be exactly what we think. This graph very briefly just illustrates that although there was a slight blip over the peak of the first wave of the COVID pandemic, where attackers were pivoting to using COVID-related themes, overall, in fact, the number of attacks decreased over that time, and the blip that we did see was very short-lived. So if attacks targeting our users based on a COVID premise are not the new thing, then what is? Well, I think what we have to recognize is that these changes that we see associated with the pandemic are systemic changes. And there are several of these, but I want to focus on one in particular. And that's the increased use of Wi-Fi as a way of connecting to the internet. This data from OpenSignal shows us very clearly that at some point, during the first wave of the pandemic, in various geographies across the world, there was a marked increase in connectivity to the internet using Wi-Fi, and I think we can assume that's going to be home Wi-Fi. So our users are connecting to the internet and connecting to our enterprise networks today using Wi-Fi that they're getting at home, at a friend's house, or wherever they're staying. And we know that those Wi-Fi appliances, those home routers, are notoriously insecure. This recent article speaks about several vulnerabilities in a Netgear Soho switch, but it's really not just one technology. The study by Fraunhofer shows very clearly that across a range of consumer connectivity products, security and vulnerability management in particular are really very poor. They report that there was no router or router without flaws, and that 46 of the routers that they examined had not gotten a security update within the previous year. And that's even assuming that when updates are available, the users are interested and able to upgrade them. And these vulnerabilities are not just theoretical. Their security vulnerabilities and misconfigurations are also being actively attacked. And the Mirai botnet is probably the most contemporary and famous example of that. But it's not just cyber criminals and botnet herders that are exploiting home connectivity equipment. It's also more sophisticated players. In this example, we saw home routers being targeted with a view to hijacking DNS and using that hijacked DNS to redirect traffic to malicious sites. This is an attack vector that Vikas will demonstrate. There is a name that's probably still stamped on many of our minds. This vector, this campaign dates back to more than 3 years ago now, but at its peak, it had 500,000 compromised endpoints across more than 50 devices and in more than 50 countries. And even today, a recent study shows that there are still thousands of devices that are infected with this particular brand of malware. And just to be clear, although in this presentation, we're going to be focusing particularly on the access point and the means that the user uses to connect to the internet, really what makes an access point interesting is that it's a highly functional but insecure Linux box that's connected to the same local area network as the user. And so actually everything we describe in this presentation could be transposed to other similar technologies like IoT. So what we've seen so far is that remote work using Wi-Fi has become commonplace. Your users are connecting from their homes, from their friend's house, or from some public place. And if it's a public place, quite probably they're going to encounter something called a captive portal, which is that browser screen that pops up when you have to enter your username and password in order to use free Wi-Fi. We've seen, and I think it's safe to assume that these routers are insecure or insecurely configured, and that they're a target. And so we need to proceed from the assumption that the primary mechanism that your users are leveraging to access the internet is under the control of someone else. At best, it's untrusted. At worst, it's fully compromised or malicious. And our assertion is that the primary security mechanism with which we're responding to that threat is secure remote access. And to demonstrate that, just a quick show of statistics from our Security Operations Center expressing the increased demand for services and support around virtual private network technologies at the peak of the first wave. And you can see very clearly there how over March, April, and May, there was a sudden explosion of demand as companies hurried to either scale out or add new secure remote access technologies. And so what we want to do now is take some time to show you in a very practical way what it means if you assume that the user's router is compromised. And our argument is that there's a number of new and unusual threats that come into play that you need to be taking into account in your threat model. And so I'm going to hand it over to Vikas to talk you through some examples that illustrate this point.
So thank you, Charles. Before we're going to go into the examples, I'm going to introduce a couple of technical concepts that you'll hear me repeat quite often throughout those scenarios. So to make sure that everybody's on the same page, let's just look at what those are and how they play out in reality. So the first one is Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP, as it's known more frequently. This is quite a common protocol that's used throughout network infrastructure, and it is typically used to supply IP addresses, DNS configuration, and routes as well. This DHCP protocol is quite feature-rich. It even includes something called a pre-boot execution environment that we will look at a bit later. And what this does, it allows you to boot an operating system over the network. And we'll see how we can play with that. Another concept that you'll hear me talk about is captive portals. Now, you might hear, or you might know this in a different form, but I think everybody in the audience have encountered this before. To think of your complimentary coffee Wi-Fi, think of the Wi-Fi at hotels, at airport lounges, even at the mall. All of these lounges normally require you to agree to certain terms and conditions, maybe even supply information about yourself before it'll allow you internet access. Now, what's important to note about a captive portal is it puts your machine or your device in a compromising state. Specifically, it exposes your browser to interact with the captive portal. Now, some vendors, VPN vendors or secure remote access vendors, use mitigations to limit the impact of that. For example, something called a captive portal mini browser, which is a proprietary browser that they use to force the user to interact with the captive portal. You'll hear me talk about that a bit later as well, so pay attention to that. Next, we're going to look at some legends or diagrams that some that we use, or pictorials that we use in this interface. So whenever you see the first icon at the top, it's the victim. That's who we're targeting, or that has been compromised, or that we want to compromise. Next, we'll see the malicious access point icon. So that's either a compromised access point, home router, captive portal, IoT device. That is under the control or influence of the attacker, the last icon there at the bottom. So the attacker will also supply additional infrastructure that they will use, but the whole idea is the attacker wants to get onto that device or influence the way that your victim's device behave. So let's get into the first scenario. In this scenario, we're going to use DHCP to inject a root into onto your victim machine to change the direction or the traffic flow of something like a RDP session with the idea of capturing credentials. This will happen even when the VPN is established. So how does this play out in reality? So for example, our victim is sitting behind a compromised home router, for example, and they establish a VPN to your corporate network with the intention of accessing a RDP session on your trusted network. But what we have is a compromised access point, and our attacker has injected a route that overlaps with a subnet that so happens to be the RDP session. And with this attack, we can now pop the traffic out of the VPN. Now, if your user or your victim tries to connect to the RDP session, instead they will be presented with something like this, and they will have to supply, well, they probably will supply their credentials, thinking that this is a legitimate session. But in fact, what's happening is it's connecting to the attacker's malicious service called, in our case, we're using something called Seth, created by Adrian Vollmer, to illustrate the fact that we can capture credentials. Now, this attack is, or this scenario is possible because of something that's lacking called the root precedence enforcement by the VPN client. So if your VPN client has root precedence or something in that line, then make sure it's enabled so you can, mitigate this type of behavior or attack. Next, let's look at another scenario in which we will talk about, we will use that pre-boot execution environment option of DHCP, in which we will use DHCP to boot our own operating system. Operating system that's under our control, we will be serving that over the network if that victim's machine is requesting or supporting PXE boot at startup. So how does this play out? So you'll see on the left, we have our compromised access point home router. And Ashal mentioned earlier that this one is running Linux, and many of these home routers use a service called DNSMask. It's feature rich. It's like the Swiss Army knife of home router services. It's got DHCP capabilities, DNS resolution, TFTP, trivial FTP that is used especially when you're serving PXE images. So our attacker has compromised it, set it up in such a way that it will serve content which is highlighted or listed on the right-hand side. So this infrastructure is under control also of the attacker. And here we are waiting for an HTTP connection to serve the operating system that we control. Now note, this operating system has also been modified to facilitate remote access or remote administration. So when it's booted, it will connect back to the attacker's infrastructure. So how does that look? Here we see our victim attempting to, victim's machine is starting up, and part of the first startup process, it's looking for a PXE, a DHCP server, and our attacker's DNSMask server is actually serving that from the compromised host, including the pre-boot execution environment file that bootstraps our operating system. And now you can see we are serving the operating system that we modified to the victim. And once it's finished booting, our reverse shell or reverse remote access capabilities will be enabled once it hits the attacker's reverse shell. We will see here that we have access to the host. Also, we see that there's a disk attached to this machine. When we mount that disk, we notice there's a Windows operating system present. Now, in this case, the Windows operating system is not protected using full disk encryption, which means we have we have full access to that disk. We can do anything we want to it. To demonstrate that, we just say, well, here's this attacker's fortunately not that malicious. We're just modifying the file system. So when the victim logs into their account, some files will be displayed as part of this demonstration. So next comes the captive portal, into captive portal. What we're going to use captive portal for in this case is to leverage the whole behavior, and we're going to modify that behavior using the captive portal mini browser that I talked about, the proprietary captive portal interface from the VPN's agent side. hoping to trick the user into a social engineering attack. So you would start off with the victim connecting to a network, all right, thinking that this is maybe the coffee shop, right? The Captive Portal mini browser here, depicted by the little gray box there, is this proprietary browser I spoke about. And this is what you would normally expect to see. So greeted by some sort of logo from the Captive Portal side, agreeing to do something, maybe provide some login details or something else, right? But in fact, what happened is our attacker has modified the content, and now we are serving something that looks kind of official, right? And if our user so happens to click on that link there, we'll see it asks to run this HTML application. And further hoping that the user clicks on that run button there. If they do, we have code execution. So we just highlighted that icon there on the taskbar there to illustrate the point. But because this is just for the demonstration, but we can also hide that if we really need to, right? But what is really achieved here is that the attacker now has remote access to our victim, so they can do whatever they want there. So coming up to this point, was influenced quite greatly by the work we did last year in exploring what does it mean to use a VPN client, and what does it actually benefit? What are the actual benefits when it comes from a security point of view when working with untrusted networks, especially looking at it from a Captive Portal point of view. So we started off using a tool called Responder. Now, if you're familiar with that, Responder is a type of penetration testing tool that is used to facilitate some compromise of Windows authentication tokens. Now, authentication tokens could also be what they also refer to as Intel M hashes. Now, these Intel M hashes are provided by Windows services when they're trying to typically connect to a Windows mapped drive, for example, or let's say another resource like a printer through which they've previously authenticated. So Responder allows us to capture these hashes, and then you can crack them offline. So in the Captive Portal state, we control, the attacker controls everything. They control the DNS, they control the routing, they control DHCP, and basically they can choose how content is resolved, especially host names, right? So coming back to our friendly Captive Portal interface there, we'll see the VPN agent detected there's a Captive Portal between it and the internet, so it can't establish the VPN. It launches its Captive Portal mini browser, asking the user to interface with this Captive Portal. But because we control the DNS, we can influence anything that's mapped, like I said, on the network level. And if there is a service during this period that wants to connect to let's say, a Windows drive, our Responder service will happily oblige in talking to it, but at the same time, we will steal and lift some juicy Intel M hashes that we'll crack. And if this is a weak password, we have the password, right? So this leads us to the whole thing. It's like, what is VPN supposed to do, and how do we benefit from this really when dealing with a compromised environment? And I'll now let Charles answer that difficult question.
Thanks, Vikas. So Vikas has demonstrated a variety of attacks that become possible because the user is under the influence of a malicious access point. And typically our response to these kinds of threats is to shovel victims' traffic down a VPN, put them in a secure tunnel, and keep them out of the influence of the bad guys. But what is it that a VPN actually gives us? Well, we know technically we get confidentiality, integrity, and access control. But conceptually, we are of the opinion that what enterprise admins are expecting is something that we would call security equivalency. And our definition of security equivalency is that there's an expectation that a user connected via a VPN from a remote location, no matter how malicious, should be confronted with and expect to deal with the same threats and risks as a user who's directly connected to the LAN. We're not saying that's what VPNs are offering. We're saying that's what we believe our admins and architects expect once the VPN is established. So in our previous work, we set out to verify whether, in fact, that was the case. And the first thing that we did was to define 4 states or 4 modes that a VPN could find itself in. And you'll see depicted on this grid, firstly, there's two configuration modes. In standard mode, we've taken the VPN basically just off the shelf and configured it only enough to get it working so the user can connect. In lockdown mode, we've really gone to maximum effort to address the threats that a malicious captive portal might present. And then we have two states, captured and online. In the captured state, the AP is not allowing the endpoint to connect to the internet. So this is the state that you'd be in if you were behind a captive portal, but of course a malicious access point can initiate this state at any time using a variety of mechanisms. So that's captured state. The online state is where the internet connectivity has been established and the client has been able to make a connection with the gateway. The tunnel is fully established, everything's working as expected. So that gives us these four scenarios in which we want to test VPN products. We then went on to define a variety of different threats. So these are attack vectors that may present themselves to an actor who has control of the access point. These are not specifically important or significant attack vectors, but they are all practical, technical, and they can be proven in the lab. So that gives us 6 threat scenarios that we wanted to test. And then we combine those, and that's what you see in this complex looking grid in front of you now. You'll see the 4 quadrants represented, just like we saw in the beginning, captured and online, standard and lockdown mode. And then you'll see for each threat that we identified, a column within that quadrant. So there are 6 columns representing the 6 threats in each quadrant. And then there are 6 rows representing 6 vendors. That's a mix of traditional VPN vendors and more contemporary so-called secure zero trust vendors. And that gives us the 6x6 grid within each quadrant. And then we tested each product against each one of those threats. And the coloration gives you an indication of results. Red meaning that the threat was successful, we could execute that threat. Green meaning the technology successfully mitigated that threat. And the progression is clear. You can see very clearly that without special configuration in that captured state, without connectivity to the internet, none of the products we tested could mitigate any of the threats that we conceived. As you move to the top right and we start implementing these more sophisticated controls, some of the products start mitigating some of the threats. But really, it's not looking good. The majority of the threats are still firing as we would expect. Once the VPN is established, but without special configurations in the bottom left quadrant, you see similar behavior. Some of the threats being mitigated, but really most of them are still triggering as expected. But then finally, as we get to the end state, where we've hardened the VPN the way we would expect, and we have the tunnel established, then very few of these threats are still firing. Now, to make that practical, I want to go back to the responder attack that Vikas talked us through and just illustrate how that looks. So in the standard mode, without connectivity, responder works against all the vendors. In standard mode with connectivity, it works against all but one vendor. In lockdown mode, without connectivity, it works on half the vendors, but is mitigated by half. And finally, even in the best case, there are still vendors who fail to mitigate this threat. So the behavior of the vendors in the face of these kinds of threats is not consistent at all. And if you want to get any mitigation, you need to make sure that you're configuring your devices in accordance with those threats. So next we want to talk to you, we talked a little bit about the legacy products, the sort of traditional VPNs. There's also a new way of thinking, these so-called zero trust products, perhaps personified by Zscaler. And so Vikas is going to just talk us through the differences we could expect to see between something like Zscaler and traditional VPNs.
Thank you, Shaul. So if you think about VPNs and how long we've been dealing with them, VPNs are around about 25 years, maybe more. Coming through from mid-90s up to where we are now. And all the incidents that we've heard of in the last, let's say, 6 months, maybe longer, maybe into the start of 2020, the buzzword zero trust has been used more and more. And everybody's trying to understand where does this fit in and what does it mean for us. Now, talking about Zscaler, this is a technology that's familiar to us. And it might not be familiar to you. So let me first introduce some concepts so that we can just set the scene so you can understand where we're coming from. and then we'll just show you how Zscaler perform in a similar type of compromised captive portal environment or captive compromised router environment. Also caveat, please speak to the Zscaler people directly if you want more of official communication about their product. I'm sure they will be happy to oblige to clarify and answer your questions. So Zscaler offers two ways of connecting through them to the internet, as well as to specific services that your organization might wish to expose. One of the straightforward ways to do this, but also limited to only a specific set of functionality, is ZIA or Zscaler Internet Access. So think of it as a policy-based HTTP proxy that's running locally on your endpoint. They have an agent that you deploy like a VPN client called Zscaler Client Connector. And this basically facilitates the connectivity, the proxying on your local device. And it will then take specific traffic that you configured through proxy auto configuration scripts, as well as just a blanket pass-through, if you will, to their Zscaler cloud that enables them to do all sorts of validation on the traffic and fingerprinting of maybe an identifying of malicious traffic, and also help with DLP type style attacks or identification of anomalous behavior. But everything relies in this paradigm on identity providers that facilitate single sign-on, because the user experience is quite important when dealing with a lot of services behind this technology. You don't want users to get login fatigue going to multiple sites having to re-authenticate. So it is key that you map your specific applications through your ZIA. Now, this is, like I said, a bit limited to HTTP, HTTPS type traffic specifically. If you've got legacy protocols that's not necessarily compatible with this, you would need to look at something called ZPA or Zscaler Private Access, for example. This type of solutions are a lot closer to what we would understand, VPNs to offer. But there's a difference, a major difference, and this comes into the way that it plays in this technology space, is that it is app-centric. So Gartner has defined this whole app-centric way of doing things, where users are assigned specific access to apps, as opposed to the traditional implicit trust type network-centric approach. This is achieved through what they call the inside-out approach, where you need to deploy a Zscaler app connector close as possible to the service that you wish to expose. And this will then bridge that app into the Zscaler cloud, and through using the Zscaler Client Connector agent running on your user's endpoint, map traffic then through that way. So at no point do you actually expose a port or a service through to the internet like you would with a traditional VPN agent. It's all just connecting out from the trusted network and from the remote user site into the Zscaler cloud, and it's brokered that way. What's important to note is the Zscaler Client Connector has two ways of getting traffic into the Zscaler cloud from the endpoint. You can use the traditional IP routing base, and if you're running Windows, there's a feature that's highly recommended that you look into. It's called packet filtering, which means that you can push traffic directly into that packet filter without having to worry about attacks like I demonstrated earlier about a route manipulation. So how does Zscaler Client Connector add up to, how does it deal with captive portals? So we've seen that it's got two modes in dealing with it, where the fail close state is where it just detects there's something between it and the internet, and it will literally, say, I'm not doing anything, not allowing any traffic to the internet or any other traffic going out. That's important to note that in that state, the user needs to find a way to circumvent that, but the Zscaler Client Connector will not facilitate any network traffic. Another aspect that it can be configured in, which is the default one, is called the fail open, where it basically backs off for a period of time when it detects there's something behaving like a captive portal. And in that state, it would then allow the user to interact with the captive portal or that malicious access point. And in this state, it is important to note that we see that it is also vulnerable to the attacks we've seen against traditional VPNs. So there is this compromise in technology that is applicable to this scenario as well. So Charles mentioned zero trust earlier, and can you really compare it to secure remote access? When we start looking at the technologies and specifics like internet access management, granular resource control, monitoring, and inspection of network, those facets are there, and it's important to note that they are similar, but the way they function also with similar purpose. But where zero trust is different from secure remote access is it's not a technology, right? It's not a specific vendor. We have to think about it as principles or a mindset. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about the verify explicitly, right? Transactions need to be authenticated and authorized. We're not extending the perimeter. We're applying least privileges concepts to segment and control specific pinpoint access. And also assume breach is an important tenet as opposed to looking at an implicit trusted network where you think your environment is safe and you're trying to keep the bad guys out. And this is important tenet to remember, that zero trust is not a technology. It's a concept, and it's a mindset. I'm going to hand over now to Charles to close this out.
Thanks, Wikus. All right, so what I hope you've taken from this is, if we assume, as I think we must, that the access point is malicious or compromised, then there is an entire range of new threats impacting the endpoint or impacting your network traffic or impacting your environment that probably, without very, very careful care, your traditional secure remote access technology is not protecting you against. And that's true not just for the traditional quote unquote VPN technologies, but also for the newer generation so-called zero trust technologies, unless they are used in a very specific way to mitigate against those threats. So that being the case, well, what should we do? We've given a lot of guidance on these slides, but in summary, the first thing that you need to recognize is that if someone else controls the access point, then they threaten the endpoint. And you need to take that into your threat model and build your security from that point on. Next, you need to appreciate that traditional VPNs, or as I said, even the sort of newer school zero trust technologies on their own and without very, very careful care, are probably not positioned to counter the malicious access point, even if that's what your expectation is. So coming away from this talk, when you get back to the office, you're not going to go back to the office, are you? Then what should you do? Well, Wikus showed a very specific attack, which involved overriding route precedents. This is it's an attack vector that some of the products do have mitigations against. It's what allowed us to do the RDP man-in-the-middle attack. And we would encourage you to go and speak to your vendors, engage with them, understand how their technology can mitigate this threat, and make sure that that's enabled in your environment. Next, a significant number of the attacks that Wikus demonstrated and that we tested in our evaluation involve exploiting split tunneling. Split tunneling, as you know, is that feature of VPNs that you use to send some traffic to the enterprise and some traffic to the internet in order to improve performance. Now, split tunneling creates a lot of problems because it allows us to redirect traffic to malicious places outside of the control of your corporate security infrastructure. Microsoft presents or recommends an alternative, which is possible on any product, called the forced tunnel, but with exceptions. Basically, the idea is that you channel almost all of your traffic into the enterprise with some very specific exceptions. Now, that list of exceptions doesn't have to be small. You can throw in just about anything high bandwidth that the user might need or want, provided that you know what it is. Facebook, YouTube, Salesforce, Office 365, put them all in there. But make sure that everything else, including traffic to the local LAN, rather goes through the tunnel. And finally, once again, we broadly exploit our control over DNS when we own the access point to facilitate these attacks. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that as soon as the user is connected, the VPN product forces the DNS cache to be flushed, and that DNS is served exclusively from your environment to the endpoint. Focus on those three things primarily when you get back to the office, and you would have made good progress. Once that's done, given a little bit more time, we would encourage you to do just two things. The one is visit our website. We've got an extensive set of resources on this problem. The previous work, background to this presentation, a very detailed paper on recommendations, demo videos, you name it. And take some time to have a look at that in detail and internalize these risks that are faced by your home users. Make sure that you understand them and make sure how they apply to your risk appetite and your environment. And then finally, in the longer term, we would encourage people to consider some alternative paradigms. Really, this problem emerges from the fact that you don't have control over the user's access point. You can't patch it, you can't configure it, you can't monitor it. And that happens because you're depending on your users to use their own free home internet to connect. Maybe it's time to consider other alternatives, like providing your home users with connectivity and IT that's sponsored and controlled by you. There's some wonderful hardware-based SD-WAN products that are remotely controllable via the cloud. You ship the user an access point, you configure it, you control it, you force the traffic down the VPN. We've seen it done and it works very nicely. Or even consider using mobile data or with maybe a private access point, mobile access point for your remote workers. And then on top of that, we would really encourage you to begin your zero trust journey. And just to reiterate what Vic has said, zero trust is not about buying a different technology. It's a different mindset that assumes that all of these components are compromised and properly mitigates the threats that they represent. And it's a model that assumes that breach is inevitable or has already occurred. And that's the mindset that we need to switch into rather than just trying to layer technology upon technology. And with that, our time is up. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us. Once again, I would encourage you, please reach out to us, take a screenshot, follow us on Twitter so we can continue this conversation there. And finally, we have a lounge session following this presentation where we can engage with you in much more detail and at a much more leisurely pace. So we look forward to having the conversation with you there. Thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.